Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 5, The 34th Day of Planting, A Very Long Day, Part 6 of 12. It was the screaming that woke up Versa, although it took her a moment to figure that out. She forced open her eyes, and her back immediately felt stiff and achy. Confused, she blinked and looked around to orient herself. The front porch, the rocking chair, her cloak over her in the pack, the army. The army! It was running right past her on either side of the house, pursuing fleeing Salemites and slashing them as they went. Versa dropped to the planking floor and crawled over to the wall, dragging her cloak with her. She pushed the rocking chair in front of her as a meager shield, and cowered under her cloak as she blinked the sleepiness out of her eyes. It was just to be a short nap, that was all. She looked at the position of the sun. It was high, casting deep shadows on the front porch to hide her. So midday? She must have slept for 5 hours. The army and the general himself came in, and she slept through it. She chastised herself for such carelessness, although she couldn't help but think she was feeling much more refreshed, except for the kink in her back, and her neck, and her legs. She could walk those out. But when? She was going to have to rethink everything. She'd been hoping to see the general come over the wall, walk over to him and say, "I'm Versa Thorne, your daughter, and I'm here to tell you that you're making a big mistake." Not the most persuasive or compelling beginning, but she was hoping she'd be inspired with something else right after that. That's what she'd been praying for the past few days. Dear Creator, help me find a way to stop this. Salem has done so much for us. Let me do something for Salem. But each time she listened for inspiration as to what to do or say, nothing came. Well, something did come, but she ignored it. It was a faint suggestion that she didn't need to do anything at all, that there was already a plan, that she should get to the ancient site right now. But Versa wanted to do her part. If Thorne wouldn't listen to his daughter, one that he loved once, then who would he listen to? As Versa watched the men and soldiers running past her, she began to wonder if her long nap wasn't somehow part of his plan. How could anyone possibly sleep through the coming of the army? Maybe the only way one could sleep through it was if the Creator put them to sleep. She looked up at the sky. "Is this your doing?" she asked quietly, angrily. "Please let me do something good for Salem. What should I do now?" The answer came clearly. Wait. Versa grumbled and did her best to get comfortable. Boscos looked up from the hand he was bandaging and stared at surprise as his wife walked over to him. "Is that fast or what?" she grinned. How did you get up here so fast?" Noria kissed him and sat down to watch him work. The middle-aged man who was Bosco's patient nodded sheepishly at her. "Been a little while since I've used a hatchet," he explained. "Tried to show my grandson how to be safe with it." "And a lesson well learned," Bosco said, "judging by the look of horror on his little face when he came to see your stitches." Noria chuckled. "I'm so sorry, but that's kind of funny." "My wife thought so, too. Not a lot of sympathy from her, either," the man admitted. Boscos nudged his wife. "So, how did you get here so fast? Where are the children?" "Tolly is riding with my father, and Callia fell asleep in the carrier with my sister. I decided to try riding as fast as you, and, well, here I am." "Well, not that I mind, but I don't have our campsite set up yet. I was expecting you to be another couple of hours." "I can set up camp for us. But what I really want to know is, what happened with Papa Shem? And what did Mama Calla think of it?" Bosco squinted. "My mother?" "Yes, she followed you. Haven't you seen her? I saw the horse she rode grazing with the others down the slope." "Are you sure?" "Positive. Noria said. It has a very distinctive face, half brown and half white. I was watching for her to return. I saw Papa Shem and Zadok ride down, but not her. You really haven't seen her?" Bosco's face darkened. Noticing his brother, he called, "Lek, anyone say anything about seeing Mama up here?" Lek came over. "Mama? She's not here." Yes, she is," Noria insisted. "She followed your father, wanting to watch him in action. I watched her right up here. The horse she took is on the other side." Lex surveyed the area, but there were tens of thousands of people now in the massive tableland, with more pouring in every minute. She could be anywhere. "People want a word with her more than they want to see your father," Noria said. But Bosco shook his head. "Mama would always check in on us first. Lek, I don't like this." "Neither do I," he said, scanning the crowd. Noria rubbed her legs nervously. Maybe there was an emergency somewhere that she's helping with, and she couldn't get away to come see you." "I'm going to put out the word that we're looking for her," Lek decided. "Uncle Pato put people in charge of different sections. I'll find someone and tell them that we're looking for her." He took off in a jog toward the ruin. Noria tried to smile away Bosco's deepening worry. "She's fine, boss. I'm sure of it." The rest of the army progressed rather quickly through the canyon. Once they mastered the numerous ropes going up and over the walls, the thousands of women and children far behind them were also no longer struggling, especially since it was downhill. It was almost fun, Guide Lannard thought to himself, once he passed John Offra, who had raised his eyebrows at him in a most disappointed way. Behind Offra were a few hundred soldiers, lounging in the grasses of a side canyon, but Lannard didn't know why. He was too distracted by Offra's jacket to think about the soldiers. There was something about those brass buttons, something weirdly familiar, something angry even. How did Offra get a jacket with brass buttons? Worse, how did Offra even get here? Didn't he die? Colonel Offra had been calling something about quiet canyons when he spied Lannard, and no matter how hard Lannard tried not to look at him, Offra's eyes gripped his gaze and wouldn't let go. It was like being stared down by a ghost. Lannard pushed his way through some scrawnier privates to get past the old colonel as fast as he could, goosebumps rising on his skin at an alarming rate. After that, the going was far more enjoyable. Once Lannard put his silky purple robe back into his pack to keep it from snagging, and changed his silk pants and tunic for regular army clothes, he challenged some of the younger soldiers to see who could scale the next wall the fastest. Of course, the guide of the Creator won every time, and Lannard was sure it was because the Creator was with him, not because the soldiers let him win. It was shaping up to be a rather pleasant day. The air was cool and comfortable, the sun was shining yet again, and the news had come up through the soldiers that there were only 2 walls left. Lannard smiled and rubbed his hands in anticipation of the wall looming before him. Stand back, everyone," he announced. "Watch the guide in action." He took a running start, leaped for the wall, caught the bedroll rope part of the way up, and quickly pulled himself to the top. He stood up there, arms outstretched, and bowed to the applause of the soldiers and the first group of women catching up to them. With a broad grin, he turned around and slid down the rope easily, landing in front of a middle-aged man not quite 50. He chuckled and patted Lannard on the back. "And here I thought guides were wrinkly old men with white hair and canes." "Not this guide," Lannard said. "Only 1 more wall? I'm rather disappointed about that. But I'm sure there'll be new challenges ahead of us." He started a fast walk, weaving between the soldiers, who naturally made way for him, and burst into a grin when he saw the last wall. It was enormous. He looked around the mass of men waiting up against it, not climbing. "What's going on?" battle, sir. Guide. The Salemites are fighting. We thought it was safer on this side. Leonard's chin dropped. Fighting? Salemites aren't supposed to fight. They don't have weapons. They have pitchforks, hatchets, and bows and arrows, a captain told him. Major Croup folded his arms. And we have swords. Well, most of us do, anyway. Come on. I've been waiting to see Salem for far too long. I'm not going to worry about a few hatchets. As if a dozen angry Salemites were enough to stop the mighty Idumean army, he grabbed a bedroll rope and began to steadily climb up the wall and slide down again, landing among a crowd of cowering soldiers. It was the noise he heard first. It was clearly more than a dozen rebellious farmers. He jogged to the narrow entrance, unimpeded because no one was willing to leave the wall, and the view on the other side froze him in place. For a full minute, he could do nothing more than stare at the vastness of Salem, the sheer enormity of the number of houses, animals, and fields. Then his gaze shifted to the scene closer at hand. Tens of thousands of men, many in blue, others in plain clothing, fighting and screaming and dying a mere half-mile down the slope. His face tightened. There was a reason he wanted to be in charge of supplies. When he was younger, the thought of fire and death and body parts fascinated him. He even once pleaded, unsuccessfully, with a young Captain Thorne to let him ride to the ruins of Moorland just to gawk at the carnage. But then, when he was 22, he witnessed his first bloody battle and lost his appetite for fighting. To be honest, everything about it terrified him, even more than supply lists. That same horror filled him now, and there was nothing he wanted to do more than turn around and climb back over the wall to where it was safe and crowded with soldiers. Actually, that wasn't a bad idea. He spun and started again for the wall, but stopped. The army, apparently inspired by their guide's bravery, were scaling the wall again, but perching on top of it, awaiting his response. If it ever got back to Thorne that Leonard had retreated, it would be Leonard's last day. "It's great!" he called out in a shaking voice. "And we're prevailing! Come on!" He bounded out of the canyon and darted behind the first large boulder he spied, well away from the fighting. So what if people thought he was a coward? He was the guide. He needed to be protected and preserved. Feeling somewhat shielded, he peered around the rock and glanced again at Salem. But all he could focus on were towers, massive ones, all flying thin, long black banners. Perrin Shin built those towers, Leonard knew. The old colonel was everywhere. Leonard gripped the boulder in front of him, as if worried someone would yank it away and expose him. Afra's jacket, the one he was wearing when Leonard saw him earlier, it had brass buttons. They hadn't had brass buttons since Shin's day. The old colonel was everywhere. Leonard put his head against the boulder and shrank like a terrified 16-year-old as yells and cries and screams from the battle drifted up to him. People were stabbing, bleeding, dying. This wasn't going to be such a good day after all. This was a bad idea. Oh, this was a bad idea. The major and the captain continued to shout orders, but no one was listening. It really didn't matter, though. It wasn't as if the soldiers were disciplined or practiced enough to do anything organized, but what they were doing was enough. The Salemites had no fight in them. True, there was a man here or there who aggressively forged onward with his pitchfork or hunting knife, stabbing and slashing with abandon, but for every one of those, there was another 100 cowards who hacked half-heartedly with their hatchets, or, even worse, after a plunge or two with a pitchfork, dropped their weapons in horror and begged for forgiveness, as if they felt badly for wounding their enemy. There's no room for empathy on the battlefield, the major and the captain knew. Once you get right down to it, no room for it in life either, not if you want to be a success. And so, even as the two officers shouted orders, they didn't worry that no one was following them. Salemites were surrendering left and right, up and down. Many just fell on the ground, weeping and crying for mercy. That was where the true skill of the army of Idumea manifested itself. No empathy and no mercy. It's a war, after all. A few hundred Salemites had been rounded up already as prisoners for Thorne's interrogators, but the rest would simply take back their properties if allowed to live, especially those women, and some very young-looking men, and the stray children here and there, and no soldier was ready to give up what he was fighting for. Even the clumsiest soldiers achieved kills by the fifth or sixth messy stab. The major and the captain continued on, eventually ceasing their shouting, and instead strolled leisurely behind the line of soldiers that was advancing northward, leveling every Salemite they found. The major stumbled, and the two men began to pay more attention to the ground below them. The amount of bodies on it was growing, and there were very few blue uniforms among the bodies clad in rough, dirt-colored clothing. As the two men progressed, they pointed at the dead, sniggering occasionally and musing as to what some corpse hoped to accomplish with the pointed hoe lying next to him. The sunshine glinted off something to their right, and the officers picked their way through the bodies to investigate. "Look at this one," the captain sneered. "The Salemites used old ladies." The major crouched to investigate and gestured to her hand. "That's army-issued, Captain." "So it is. A long knife in Salem, even bloodied. Guess she got in a stab or two. But how would an old lady in Salem get a long knife? Oh, wait a minute. Don't tell me." Following a hunch, the major, who served for a time in Sands, pushed over the body to see the woman's face. "Crete." "What is it?" The major sighed in frustration. "Another 100 gold pieces no one will collect on. Slagging Mrs. Jordan got herself killed. Worthless woman. Maybe we'll still get half for her body?" "Don't count on it," the captain said. The major stood up, and without another thought, he and the captain continued to survey the dead strewn before them. Shem rode the horse, a worthy clerk, south along the back roads on the western side of Salem. He knew the dust his horse kicked up could possibly draw attention, since the back roads weren't paved in cobblestone, but by the sounds of battle coming to the east of him, no one would be looking over soon. He stopped his horse at one of the towers and quickly climbed up to the top, where he had a clear view of the battle beyond. Eltana's army was losing, hugely. He groaned in grief at the hundreds of Salemite bodies motionless on the ground, with only a handful of blue uniformed bodies among them. Many more Salemites were retreating, running north through the houses and farms, being chased and cut down by soldiers. Shem closed his eyes, not able to witness the destruction of his people. "Is there nothing to be done for them?" "Not for them, Shem. I'm sorry. They rejected the words of the guides, and just this morning the pleadings of a rector. They made their decisions, and now their fate is sealed. As much as they wanted to believe there was more time, there does come a time when time runs out." "I suppose I should go back?" "Not yet. There's more for you to see." "Perrin?" "Yes, he's here, but on the other side of the valley. He's the one who wants you to see a few things." Shem's chin trembled. "Still securing Salem, isn't he?" "That's his calling, after all. Death doesn't change our callings. Look." Shem's eyes were directed to the middle of the battle, where a line of Salemites, tied together, were being led by soldiers. "Prisoners!" "Yes, to be taken in for questioning. Lemuel has 2 questions. First, where are the Salemites hiding?" But Anno already told them about the temple site, the current one. Jatsi told us Thorn believed him. Ah, but like a good worldly general, he believes nothing until he has multiple verifications of that information. Shem smacked his forehead. Oh, they'll talk. They'll crumble and they'll tell him about the ancient site. They will. And instead of marching north, the army will head west. Lemuel will find a horse and be at the cliff tonight. No, we're not ready. There's still people trying to get to safety, and young Pear will never make it in time. There are many others waiting in their houses to ambush any soldiers coming to take them. Some soldiers will break ranks if Lemuel heads west to yet another canyon. They'll think he's cheating them out of their reward, and they'll begin taking over the houses, resulting in more bloodshed. But there are also a few faithful families scattered throughout Salem, trying to convince those remaining to leave. They still have a chance to get out, but only if Lemuel continues north with the army. Once the remaining Salemites see that their fighters were conquered by the army of Idumea, they will finally give up and run to the roots tomorrow morning. There will be injured, too. They'll need time to get up to the ancient temple. He nodded. Understood. So how do we convince Lemuel to go north when all of his prisoners are crying about the west? In a moment. There's another question Lemuel has. Where are the Shins? He's beginning to accept that fact every time he looks at Perrin's towers, that the Shins weren't held here by force. He wants to find the estates, and someone will reveal that to him as well. Shem began to get antsy. So I need to get them out now. In another moment, Shem. Lemuel is scared, deep down scared, that the Shins are alive and well in Salem. He picked up on that key word. Scared? Lemuel wouldn't be the only one terrified to realize Mari Shin is still alive. After all the stories, after all the lies, to see her still alive would shake a lot of men. Shem's mouth went dry. What are you suggesting? First, Lemuel has to believe there's still a group of Salemites hiding in the canyon behind the temple. Shem, how would you like to play guard or spy, just one last time? Despite all of the grim news he had just received, he couldn't help himself. He began to smile. Tell me what to do. No one at the ancient temple site had seen Calazenas. No one, even though every last Salemite up there searched all around them for the guide's missing wife. There was no word of her. At the large camping site in front of the ancient temple, the Zenuses, Briders, and Shins were growing worried. Miki lay on her bedroll, overcome with fatigue, nausea, and dread. Something's wrong, I know it is. Ralph's wife Madeline sat near her, smoothing her black hair. Don't fret yet, Miki. Everyone's looking for her. We'll find her. Don't worry. Lori, sitting nearby nursing one of her twins, nodded at her cousin. Just rest for now, Miki. After Miki closed her eyes, Lori shared a look with her sister-in-law. It's because the matriarchal cow didn't inspect the site and lead the herd here, Madeline whispered. As time wore on, their anxiety increased. Boscos eventually wandered to where their father had battled earlier that morning. Lek joined him. What are you looking for, boss? I had a thought a few minutes ago, he said in a low tone. Too many people and children were watching him from their camp. Lek, where were those bowmen? Lek exhaled. I wasn't exactly paying attention at the time. Boscos looked around for someone who had been conscious during the fight. He noticed Sam holding one of his twins and waved him over. Where were those two bowmen, Sam? Sam paled. Oh, no. Boscos shook his head. Don't say that. Don't say that. Just tell me, do you remember where they were? I thought one was right here. Sam nodded. The other was over there, maybe 20 paces. He walked to the spot. Look, blood splatter. We didn't remember to clean this area, I guess. Boscos turned to face the direction the bowman fired. So if one of the arrows had released well, Lek was already covering his face. They both did, boss. I saw that much. Boscos cleared his throat. The trajectory would be, he pointed to the slope rising above the campsite. It was steep, intersected by many ridges, and covered by waist-high scrubby brush. Dear Creator, no! Lek cried, and took off in a run, with Boscos following. Sam dropped off Maggie by Lori and ran after the brothers. Miki sat up. Where are they going? Lori bit her lip and watched them run up the slope. I don't know. Ralph and Cambo, speaking to yet another person who hadn't seen Calazinas, saw Lek, Boscos, and Sam running, so they immediately followed. At the beginning of the ridges, Lek began to mumble, Please no, please no, please no. Boscos took his arm. Lots of brush to check. Lek, you stay here. I don't think you're up to. I'm looking, he shouted, and started out along one of the steep ridges. Looking for what, boss? Cambo asked tentatively. To see where those 2 arrows fell, was all Boscos replied. Ralph closed his eyes at the suggestion, then gestured to the rest of the brothers and cousins to come up. Many more men and a few women came too. 2 arrows were fired this morning. We're looking to see where they landed, was all the explanation Ralph gave. No one asked for more. In just moments, the slope was covered with people, looking cautiously under every bush and shrub. Down below, Miki began to sob as she saw her husband join in the search. Madeline held her tight and looked with worry at Lori, who had a tear trickling down her cheek. The wait was grueling, the search silent. The nearly 200 people assisting knew what they were hoping and not hoping to find. They looked for 5 minutes, then for 10. Lek reached the other side of the ridge and peered over the edge in case something had fallen on the other side. Near the bottom, Salima stood with the rest of the women and children, watching him intently, praying he wouldn't be the one to discover anything. She held the hands of Brighter and Fennec, each biting their lips in worry. The wives watched their husbands, and the sisters sat close together, praying for the best. It wasn't going to happen. A woman near a stand of thick brush screamed before turning around to retch in the shrub behind her. Immediately the searchers converged on her sight, each wearing the same expression of devastation. Move! Move! Boscos yelled as he hurdled bushes and slipped a few times in his frantic run to the spot. Lek remained paralyzed in place. The crowd moved to let Boscos through, and 2 men caught him before he got too close. Everyone at the ancient temple site heard him scream, Mama! From behind a tree, Shem peered at the fields before him, strewn with bodies and fighting men. It was chaotic, with men on both sides flailing inefficiently and reckless, none of them trained enough to handle their weapons. On the one hand, it was fortunate there might be a few survivors. On the other, the only thing worse than dying in battle was dying slowly. Shem tried to ignore the fighting and instead searched the bodies for what he needed. It would be nearby. That's why he was directed to come here. Beside a barn door, he saw it, 2 houses away. The next part was tricky. Shem glanced around, then started moaning and limping as fast as he could toward the barn door. A soldier started running for him, and Shem dropped to the ground as if he suddenly lost consciousness. The soldier jumped over him and continued on. Shem peeked open an eye to see if anyone else was near, then rolled to his stomach and continued his already wounded and dying crawl to the barn, hoping no one else would think him worth engaging. It worked. A minute later, he reached the barn door and crawled past the dead officer lying before it. Shem scanned the barn to see if anyone was there. Only a disinterested goat. He dragged the officer into the barn. "What do we have here?" he whispered, and he took off his jacket. "A colonel, is it? Thank you, Perrin. I always wanted to be a colonel. General's too high," Shem explained to the corpse as he undid the buttons and worked off the blue jacket. Shem couldn't see any visible signs of trauma. Maybe this man expired because of a heart attack from climbing too many walls. At least his uniform was clean. "But a colonel, you see," he explained as he put the jacket on and buttoned it up. It fit perfectly. "Has a great deal of power without having to be the ultimate authority." He bent down and started to undo the trousers. "Sorry about this, but this is what we call a field promotion." He slipped the ample pants over his. "Maybe you should have lost a few inches around the middle here. Oh well, I can make it do." "Take the cap. Few men in the world have gray hair anymore. Nearly all died last year." "Gray-ing hair. Still mostly light brown." He pulled the cap off the officer and put it on. "I would have had my hair trimmed if I'd known," he said, tucking up his wavy locks under the cap. "But I'll be going so fast no one will notice my lack of grooming, right?" "Don't give anyone an opportunity to get a good look at you. Be a blur in their memory." "Understood. Do I look all right?" "Perfect. Perrin would be pleased." "All right then," he said, peering out the barn and plotting his course. "Garter on the loose. Lock up your houses." He took off in a run to the east, straight into the middle of the fighting. He headed for a knot of officers trying to direct the battle without getting involved themselves. When they saw him approaching, they stopped their shouting at soldiers who weren't listening anyway. "Pass the word along. Salemites will be claiming the rest of the people are west of here, but the truth is they're still in the canyon, northeast behind the temple. They're planning to attack us from behind if we start going west." Shem didn't wait to hear the responses. He took off to the east, to another officer pointing in earnest at a house. "Don't fall for their lie that the rest of them are in the west. They're planning another ambush, and the fallback position is in the temple in the northeast. Need to continue on there." The officer nodded as Shem took off again. He shouted to his staff sergeant, spread the word to 2 more captains, and advised another colonel that in the northeast would be the real battle, not the west, as the captured Salemites would be claiming. When Shem saw the man take off in a run to the heavily fortified second resting station, he knew he still had his rumor-spreading talent. He also knew there was no chance for him to find his assistant Anno, so he offered up a quick prayer that Anno wouldn't suffer and began to jog back to the west. He pulled the cap down low on his brow and avoided eye contact with anyone lest he be recognized by a passing Salemite. Some were frantically flailing with their gardening tools, while others were kneeling on the ground and sobbing. A few surrendered as they saw him, but he couldn't break character to help them. There was no time left for them. He shoved that horrible thought back into his mind. He would weep profusely for them later. Right now, he had a job to do. He slowed down only enough to say to anyone in authority, "Don't believe it's in the west, it's in the northeast." He darted around houses and easily avoided panicked pitchfork-wielding Salemites, hoping to treat him like hay. Eventually he stopped between 2 houses that were relatively quiet so he could catch his breath. Leaning against one house and panting, he noticed a double-wide rocking chair on the front porch, tempting him to sit down and take a rest next to a large pack someone had forgotten in their haste to leave. Instead, he chuckled lightly. "All right," he panted. "I confess, I'm not 24 anymore. Don't think I'd win the strongest soldier race today. But, Perrin, not too bad for an old man like me, right?" He scanned the area as he rested his lungs. "Anything else? Anyone else? Now's the time." He paused and listened. Nothing came to him. "All right then. Time to put away the garter and pull out the guide. He ran as fast as he could, back to where his horse was tethered. Just before he mounted, he realized he was still wearing the uniform. He slipped off the jacket, reversed it, smiled at the dull black lining that hadn't changed in 40 years, and put it back on. The cap he threw into a shrub, not wanting the estates to think they were already under attack. Now, exactly what kind of a distraction does Perrin want me to set up at the temple to scare our Lemuel? Only one person noticed him riding away. Versa pushed away the rocking chair she was hiding behind and crawled to watch Guide Zenas disappear down the road. Dismayed, she looked up. What in the world was he doing? And why did he stop here? She bit her lip as a new understanding came to her. Why he was a mere 2 feet away, catching his breath. Were you trying to send me help? Look, I realized you've sent me several chances to escape in the form of shins, briders, and now Zenas's. But please, let me still do something good first. General Thorne stood at the windows watching the battle, or what Salemites might term a battle, but he thought of as a feeble temper tantrum. Reports were coming in constantly, but within 15 minutes the rest of the Salemites who had no idea how to fight would be easily put down. He was smiling. 2 officers had confirmed it. Eltana Jordan was dead. They both recognized her. She was even clutching an army-issued long knife. Behind the resting station was a long line of Salemites, tied to each other by their wrists and fully traumatized. Obviously, none of them had expected their defeat, nor did they expect to be held captive, with dozens of soldiers pointing swords at them. Many of them were weeping, others sat in shock, and the rest were pleading to be released. There wasn't a brave soul out there. Thorne was already evaluating the canyon that many of them were gesturing to. They wanted to be allowed to run there, promising that they'd give up their lands and houses if they could just be freed. They were so weak and gullible, just like everyone else in Salem. Thorne noticed one of his colonels come running up to the station. Breathless, he hurried up the stairs and into the large gathering room. Sir, still planning to go west? He asked between gasps for air. That's where all the prisoners are desperate to go. Why? It's a trick, a lie. Their fallback position is northeast, at the temple that old man Anno mentioned. They're trying to get us going in the wrong direction, then they'll attack from behind. Thorne furrowed his brows. How do you know this? Word spreading throughout the officers. A colonel told me himself. Some of the Salemites were overheard. Another officer came bursting through the door. Sir, we have to continue to the northeast. That's where the rest of their army is hiding. The colonel gestured excitedly to the captain. See? Thorne turned back to look out the other window to the lines of weeping Salemites begging to go west. They're more devious than I gave them credit for, he mumbled. Those tears look quite genuine. Major Twig cleared his throat. Sir, which way will we proceed when the battle here is finished? West or northeast? They're desperate to go west, aren't they? Thorne said, observing his prisoners through the window. Twig stood by Thorne. Absolutely terrified. Never seen people so scared before. Quite convincing, aren't they? Thorne said thoughtfully. Too convincing, really. Sir? Pull out the first map for the northeast, Thorne ordered. We'll hit the temple at dinner time, but keep the map for the west because we'll go there tomorrow, just in case anyone is left alive. Twig waved to the men working on the maps, and a flurry of pages shuffled on the eating room table. Healy came in. General, I think I've spotted Croup. He must have recently come over the last wall. Thorne started walking to the back porch through the eating room. You mean Guide Lannard? Yes, of course. Healy cleared his throat apologetically. He's up by that boulder, perhaps watching the soldiers come out of the canyon, he said with a great deal of meaning. Lannard wasn't known for his bravery. I think we're seeing the last of the soldiers coming through now, sir. Current count? Thorne asked. A lieutenant near Healy glanced at his forms. 64,000 approximately, sir. Thorne nodded to another lieutenant. Go get Guy Lannard. Bring him directly here. He doesn't know where we're meeting. That was to have been Amory's duty. After the lieutenant left, Thorne whispered to Healy. Why is Lannard hiding, Poe? Scared? You better get over it quick. He's leading the soldiers to the temple. Is that the best idea, General? Poe whispered. Thorne scoffed. What? I'm going to attack a temple? That's the only reason he's here, Poe. This is Guide's work, not General's work. Find yourself a replacement. Your priority now is to prepare Croup for his duty. I can already see he's shaking more than our prisoners. Mari walked through her small gathering room one last time, while Shem scouted out the situation in the south and Pato got a well-deserved nap. She patted the books on the shelves again, sniffed Perrin's large stuffed chair, catching the very last remnants of his scent that still lingered deep in the fibers, ran her hand along the low table where they both rested their feet, and made her way to the bedroom. Ignoring their massive bed, she bit her lip to keep her lower jaw from trembling and went to the wardrobe. There she fingered the lock of Perrin's white hair Judith had trimmed for her, carefully folded the paper back over it again, and tucked it into her pocket. She wondered why she did that. What, was she going to return it to him? Sniggering at herself, she decided that since she didn't have his jacket to wear, which she had planned to do until Jatesy gave it to John Offra, this would be a way that Perrin could accompany her to the ancient site. Still, she was holding out for a much more dramatic accompaniment. Somehow. She walked over to his side of the bed, now frequently her side too, and ran her hand along his pillow, which she hugged every night. Maybe soon, Perrin, she whispered. It has to be soon. She wiped away her tears and looked around, knowing it was time to leave. Even the room was telling her that, almost seeming to grow impatient that she still lingered. This was the last place she was saying goodbye to. Spying the writings by her bedside table, she walked over to it, feeling again, as she had so many times that morning, Mari, Pato, Shin, it is you. She sighed, took Perrin's walking stick that the elder Bosco Zenas had given him years ago before he died, and since she didn't have Perrin's jacket, which John was still wearing, kissed the stick instead, set it back down, and left her bedroom forever. And that is the end of part 6 of 12 of chapter 5, A Very Long Day. Thank you.